It is my privilege and joy that we can continue our study in Ezra and Nehemiah in learning how to restore the waste places of our time. We have the subtitle today, God and the Covenant. We remember that they rebuilt Jerusalem almost completely. The temple was rebuilt long before, but now they established the service according to the law. The walls were rebuilt. There was security there. They had an outward representation, and they could start to be the light in the world, the purpose why God called them out to be a peculiar people. They took stands against the spiritual state. Their marriages that were with strangers were set aside. They repaired how much they could do so that they won't go against the law anymore. They even before removed the exploitation of the poor by the rich. Yes, they were not all things perfect, but they were doing something to get away from their spiritual state, from the spiritual thing in their hearts, and that they could only do by the knowledge of the law. So the knowledge of the law brought to them unity, brought to them the decisions that they made for reformation. Now we saw in the last presentations that they were praying to God and they remembered their history and how God was a forgiving God. And now they want to do something to avoid backsliding again, because they remembered the whole history and their parents were every time they went back to the old habits, to the old life. And so now they want to make a step forward in making a covenant with God in which they promise to not make the wrong decisions in marriage. They promise that they will keep the sign of the covenant, that is the Sabbath, not buying things from the strangers, and that they will take care for the support of the temple service. Now, where do covenants that humans make arise from? Are they something wrong? Not really, because in itself a covenant is a good thing. Just what depends is the motivation out of which I do a covenant. And I remember I also made covenants with God after my conversion. And I made a very strong covenant, the most strongest one that I ever did. I said to God that I will do everything, I will let nothing undone, even unto giving my physical life for the salvation of my wife and the 6 children that God gave us. That was a covenant I made in the first week after my conversion. Where did it come out? Now, yes, I wanted in my will, in my consciousness, to avoid falling apart. I wanted to have a focus, to never turn back again. Yes, it is something that can help. But why do human covenants not work in the end? I mean, why do they not remain faithful? Because we know that the term, the old covenant, it was the people that made the covenant and said, we will do and keep thy commandments. And now in Ezra, in Nehemiah, they just repeat the same thing. We will keep the law and all that is written in it. But we'll see in the next studies that they fall apart again. Why do human covenants not work. Because they come from a wrong motivation. They come from a wrong source in the heart. It's a goodwill, but a wrong motivation. That's why let us see how covenants work. And what is a covenant? A covenant is a binding. It is a connection. It is a contract, an agreement, a promise. A covenant is, in the end, dependency. And we have, as an example, the covenant that God made with Noah and the whole souls, the whole earth, that he will not destroy the earth again through the flood. And he put a sign there in the cloud that from now on it will never happen again that the earth and all the living souls should be destroyed by the flood. So the establishment of the covenant from God's side. We find in the Bible covenants, and of course you must have a covenant partner or the one that has to go into the covenant because it must be between two persons. Then there must be a reason and a purpose for the covenant. There must be a content of the covenant, and we find a sign of the covenant. So the first covenant is the creation of man, and we will look into it a little bit closer a few minutes later. Why did God create man and made a covenant with him? Because he made him king, and he was to be the administrator of the whole earth. What was the content? He should multiply, he should garden, and he should name the animals. He should care for the whole world. And there was a sign that God gave him, and that was the Sabbath. Then God made a covenant with Noah. We just saw that the destruction will not come again, and he put the rainbow as a sign. And then he makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says he should be the blessing to all the peoples, and he says he will be multiplying him like the stars on the heaven. So there will be many people, and they will be spread over the whole world. And he made a sign of that covenant that was circumcision. And then we have that what God calls the new covenant with the people of Israel. And we want to see why it's new covenant. It's a covenant for service. And the content is the law will be written in the heart, and they shall be mine. And what is the sign? It's the same sign that ever was. It's the Sabbath. And by that sign, the people that are going to be in this covenant will show in their life the love of God. Now, let's look to the new covenant. In Jeremiah 31, 33, 34. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them. Now, if you paid attention, you saw that all the covenants that we find from the Bible that God makes are unilateral covenants. That means He is the originator of the covenant. Why is that so? Now, if we understand how God created the universe, that sets, so to say, on two principles, that nothing can exist out of itself and nothing was made for itself or himself, says that the fundamental law, the basic law of everything, shows that every created being comes into a covenant relationship with God. So since everything is in need of power, everything has to take that power from outside, and it has to pass that power on. The one is the cause, The other is the effect. God made it very clear that everyone is, by the way the law of this universe function, in a covenant relationship with God. Yes, because who is the source of all power? And if no one has his own power, then God must be the source of all power. So every created being, according to the law, is in a covenant relationship with God. Because the law is a binding thing. It's a dependency. It's a dependency. And this fundamental law just sets the covenant. So let's take the example of the creation of our world. God is the one that created it, and He only can determine the reason and task of its creation. And we know there is this general rule of the law that everything was created for service. So nothing was created for itself, and nothing can exist out of itself. So we take the earth, it was not created for itself, but for the multiplication of the living beings on it, to support everything that lives on the earth. And then the sun was not made to lighten itself. It was not made for itself, but to warm up the day and to light the day. And who knows how many tasks the sun has. Then the moon was not made for itself, but to lighten the night for us here on earth, and to have other influences that we can see in our world according to the moon cycle. So nothing was made for itself. So also the human being was not made for himself. He was made to be king, administrator, and coordinator of all functions on earth. Now, we saw this created beings, according to the law, they are all in a covenant relationship with God. And they do things without even knowing that they are dependent. There is no knowledge in the earth, or yes, everyone functions according to the law set by God. But how is it with humans and angels? How do they fit into the covenant? So let's see Adam. When man was created, he was created to be a worker for God, that he is an employee of God, and an employee is in a covenant relationship. Now, if it's in a covenant relationship, does God therefore make himself dependent on man? And we know, since God is sovereign, since he's independent, since everything comes out of himself, God himself is independent. But he created the earth, and he created his universe, and he put certain elements there, or he created beings for a purpose, to have responsibility. And by creating man to be his employee, to be his king for the earth and the solar system, God, for the well-being of his creation, he makes himself dependent on man. Not for him, but for his creation. This is the covenant relationship that is not possible otherwise than through the law. So, for the well-being of the earth, man was made. And while God made him, he made himself dependent for the earth of the fulfilling of man's task. So, man was made. He was created. God didn't ask him if he wants to be his king. He just made him king. And he made him so that if he would fulfill his purpose, he would be the most fulfilled being. He made our will according to his will, so that all we want is good. we can see that we have good intentions. We want righteousness. We want truth. We want security. There's nothing bad in all those things and all the needs that we have. So it proves that God is good by that what He put in us, in our spirit, in our life. So God, by creating everything to exist not for itself and function in a circle, must enter into a covenant relationship with His creatures, in order that everyone at his step fulfills its duty. So He created the angels, who are serving spirits, and He created men that have a spirit. Did He create them for themselves? No. He created them and put them into a covenant relationship, because they have no power of their own to fulfill the task, but they were made to fulfill a task. So God determines through His law the source and the means by which angels and humans have to fulfill their task. And He made them so that they have to exercise their trust in Him. But He made trust to be an automatic action. So before you start thinking, you must trust. Without trust, you cannot think. So God made at the beginning of the function of the Spirit trust. That's the binding. Through trust, they take, and all their thoughts, all their actions that come out of their thoughts is a result of trust. That's very important to understand. The connection to the source must be an involuntary action, since you must have it before you can put your will into action. A device must first have power in order to do something. And so God put in the human and in the angel spirit trust as an automatism in order to be able to fulfill their task. So when Adam was created, he trusted God spontaneously because he was connected to Him by the covenant, by the law that God established. Every created being is by this in the covenant relationship. Only that angels and humans have, or the Spirit have the, how can I say this? They might become conscious of it, even though they cannot change it. Everyone must trust before he can act. So, how then could enter the disconnection from God? And it could only enter by self-deception. Lucifer deceived himself, and God couldn't help him. After he used all his means, Lucifer disconnected from God. And the same thing happened with humans. They got deceived and thought they would become something higher than a human, and so they stopped their trust or their worship in God. And by this, both broke the covenant relationship. You see, they were not asked to enter into the covenant relationship because trust is a thing that you must do without a choice. But now, through deception, since they have to exercise the trust, they still trust, but they don't trust now God. Lucifer trusts himself, Adam trusts his wife, Eve trusts the serpent. So there can never be an action without trust. But it's now not the trust in God anymore, because by the change of identity, trust in God is impossible. So we can become aware of our dependency. We can see it. And how then should we exercise things? We can be aware of it. So we must be aware that we always are dependent. And we are now born after Adam with the idea that we are gods. So can we be in a covenant relationship with him? Could Adam be in that covenant relationship with him anymore? Could he carry out his duty and task? Of course not. So what happened then with all that God put into his administration? The well-being of the creation of the earth can no longer be fulfilled. Earth gets into chaos. That's what we see today, is the result of Adam's breaking of the covenant. And we are all born in this brokenness of this covenant. That's why we have no choice whom we trust, because we are born in an idea that we are gods, and now our love source, that whom we trust, since we have no choice, we must trust, we are in an unlawful binding. That is sin. That is the breaking of the law. We are not in the covenant of God, and our decisions are all unfree and wrong. This is the condition of our birth. We are connected to the wrong source, because what makes the connection to God? Now, through trust, I take. But a connection to God is identity. You see, what connects a child to its mother? What is it? It's because it's mother's child. So we always are connected where is our source, where we come from. So our identity is from whom we come. And if we could come from God, then we would have the right identity, and we would trust God spontaneously in order to fulfill all the things that God made us to fulfill them. So we have the covenant that must be established through the law, because by the law, everyone must be dependent on God. But the binding thing or the unbinding thing is God my identity? Am I a created being, or am I not a created being? So the breaking of the covenant was only possible by deception, and we now are born in this deception. And we must come out from this deception. And the only way to come out is by the destruction of the old life. We must become a new identity. We must have to know that we are the child of God. And as a child of God, your trust, that is a spontaneous, an unconscious thing, goes automatically to God. You come into the covenant relationship with God, and then all your decisions are free and right. So the battle is between who am I and who am I not. So it's a battle between the lie and the truth. That's why in the covenant it's so important to understand it's about who am I? And it's about know the Lord. And it says they all will know him. That means they are all in him because they know they come from him. And Jesus came from the Father. That's why he was in a lawful connection all the time to the Father, because he knew I'm a son of God. He never used this. He destroyed this that he inherited from Mary. So Jesus is the one that reconnects humanity to God. By what? By his nature, that is by his identity, that he know who he was. So if we take the life of Jesus, we are in God automatically. We are in the covenant. That's why it is called the new covenant, because it's something that God must renew. It must become again. And it can only be when the law is written, but the law will be written in our hearts only when we know who we are. So, in order that we fulfill the covenant, we must understand first that we are born in this innate self-deception. God makes it clear to us by the inability that we can control ourselves. We must see that we are bound. We are bound to the wrong contractor. That means we have the attachment to the devil. And how can we then do what we want? The negative consequence of our thinking must be aware to us that we are prisoners. And by the law, God opens up our eyes and says, you're not in the right covenant, you are in the wrong covenant with one that is making you slaves. But in order that we should change, that we should want to change, we must be able to trust God again. That is, God must come to us and must show us his love and mercy, what he did through Christ and through his followers. And he has a model, which is Christ. And he not only has a model, he needs to make for us a new life that we can embrace by only one means, that is by faith. By faith, we must destroy this and put in this. That's how we have to do it. And it's the only way, it's through the Redeemer. He is our reconnection to God. It's his life. Without his life, no one can reconnect with God, because the wrong identity doesn't permit it to you. You must trust the wrong source. Even if you try hard to trust God, you cannot. You can only trust God when you are a new creature, when the life of Christ becomes your life. That's why in Hebrews 12, verse 1, it says very clearly, wherefore seeing we also are encompassed about with so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight. What is that? What is the weight that forces us? It's the wrong identity and sin. Yes, that where sin comes out must be put aside. And the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. So we need the Redeemer. And through the connection of the Redeemer, we are restored in the covenant relationship that initially was planned or was made by God. And we now, and this is most important, can fulfill the purpose for which we were created. That is, for service. We now don't have the service anymore to be kings on earth, but we have the service through the power of God, through the Redeemer, to bring to the world salvation. This world cannot be saved without his church, without his children. Because how shall they see God if they cannot see him in us, in his children? And why are we his children? Because we come from him. And as the Father is, so the childs are. Jesus makes it very clear. If our identity is in the Father, we are like the Father. If our identity is in the devil, we are like the devil. In John 8, he says it, when the Jew says, well, we have God as Father, and he proves to them that it's the devil who is their father, because they do his works. So you have no choice. If in this life you want to serve God, you're deceived. That's why the Jewish people, and that's why the most Christians today are deceived. They have not understood that they cannot reform the old life. Out of this old life, you have to do covenants because you want the good by your own force. This life, how does this life make the covenant? Now, this life only responds to the covenant of God. So, if the covenant is already made, in Christ it is established, we, by faith, enter the covenant. And by entering the covenant, by entering into the life of Christ and making through faith the life of Christ our life, we are automatically entering the new covenant and are heirs and are children of God. And no one ever needs to teach us again who God is, because we know Him. We are His children. Our relationship with Him is a natural one because we live from Him. So I hope we understand. God makes the covenant. A covenant is only possible because we are dependent. But God makes Himself dependent for His creature, for what He created on us. He made Himself dependent. When Jesus called His disciples, He made Himself dependent on the faithfulness of His disciples in order to finish the work, to rebuild the waste places. And He makes Himself dependent on His children today that they might finish the work and rebuild the waste places and put the wall and make things straight for the coming of the Lord. But how shall we fulfill that? Only by entering into that covenant. Now, yes, when Adam was created, when Lucifer was created, they were not asked if they want to serve God, because there is no question where there is a law. But now that we are born outside the covenant, we receive the invitation. We must do it consciously. We must want it against the inclination of our hearts. We must be convinced in our minds to go the right way with God. And then put our faith in the life of Jesus. So this is the other way. We must enter into the covenant. And when we enter into the life of Christ, we automatically enter into the new covenant and become like Him. So, will the covenant be fulfilled? Will the desire of God come to its accomplishment? Yes. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, that's Christ, and with Him 144,000, having His Father's name written in their foreheads. Why are they standing there? Because their identity became Christ's identity. They have Christ's and the Father's name, since the Christ is the Father's Son. If you have Christ, you have the Father. If you don't have Christ, you don't have the Father. That's as easy as it's possible. That's why when you have the name of the Son, then you have the name of the Lamb there. They have the name on the fathers written in their foreheads. That's the accomplishment of the covenant that God made with Abraham. The covenant will be fulfilled. Those who are invited, who are called and chosen, will enter the covenant and will finish the work. And Revelation 21:3, and I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. You see, when identity is made right, the covenant is fulfilled. We are his people. He is our God. When Jesus spoke to Mary before his ascension to heaven to see that the Father proved the new creation, he said, "Tell my disciples and Peter, I'm going to my Father and your Father. I'm going to my God and your God." That is the binding thing. It's identity that reconnected us again to God. And then the fulfillment of the law is a natural thing. So we must strive to enter the covenant. That means to want to take the life of Christ, and this life must be our life. Could God do more for us? No. We want to enter that covenant relationship. I want, and I renew it every day, because it is the fulfilling of all the desires of my heart, and is also the fulfilling of all the desires of your heart. Amen.